Hello and welcome to this edition of Turkey Talks. I am joined by Kadir Üstün from Washington and also Peter Rao, from Washington Hudson Institute. Hello, guys.
Hi, Bora. Hi, thanks for having me.
We are going to talk about the situation in Ukraine and recent developments, especially the U.S. perspective and Turkish latest tries for negotiations. Remember, both foreign ministers from Ukraine and Russia came to Antalya. But I want to start with the U.S. Perspective of this crisis. Recently, Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed to the U.S. Senate, and he asked for more support. He referred the problems that the United States faced in the past, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, etc. Peter, I want to start with you. How do you evaluate Zelensky's speech and the U.S. Policy on Ukraine?
Well, for broader context, I would say that this is a strategy Zelensky has used over the past several weeks. He gave his first address to a foreign audience when he addressed the European Council, that's the heads of governments of the European Union, and he closed with the words, "This may be the last time you see me alive," stunning the room into silence. And that so mobilized the Europeans to take action that, according to the Washington Post, the Biden administration was left scrambling to catch up and implement tough measures as well. So I think Zelensky has continued this, seeing the effect that he had both there, also in addressing the House of Commons. He spoke to an open-air rally to the people of the Czech Republic in Prague, and now he wanted to mobilize the American public. So for him, it's really important to reach out to the West and to continue the support that's flowing into the country, in large part because Ukraine and the West are in a symbiotic relationship. The West would only support Ukraine if Ukraine shows that it can fight. We still have the ghosts of the Afghan National Army hanging over our heads. And in return, the Ukrainians can only fight if they get Western support. And so Zelensky, having shown that he can fight, that he's willing to stand up to the Russians, the Ukrainian people, in a tenacious display of nationalism, pushing back on the Russians, have inspired the U.S. And his goal here is to get more assistance, more support, and quicker than at present.
What about the U.S. attitude? I mean, if you look at the crisis in Ukraine in a broader perspective, I'm talking about the Crimea war in 2014. There is a sense, especially in my country, in Turkey, that Ukraine was left to its fate. They, in a way, was used as a buffer region between NATO and Russia. And there is the feeling that the Ukrainians were spared in the name of protecting NATO and staying away from Russia. Do you agree with that? And how do you evaluate U.S. attitude, U.S. policy in Ukraine right now? Do you think the United States is giving enough support to Ukraine?
I think the U.S. is trying to straddle this line between providing military assistance to the Ukrainians without actually becoming engaged in the war as a co-combatant or a co-belligerent. And that's why there have been raucous debates over the past several days and even weeks about the type of military and lethal assistance we should provide the Ukrainians. The administration is drawing what I think is an artificial distinction between, for example, certain missile systems and the transfer of fighter jets. To me, they're both types of military assistance. So it's a difference in degree, not a difference in type. I'm all for providing Ukraine with whatever it can absorb to take on the Russians, because it's also an opportunity to, I think, strike a blow against the Russians, who are an anti-American actor by virtually any measure in Europe. More broadly, though, to your point about 2014, I think that really was a different world. The Obama administration ran much of its policy towards Russia and Europe through Berlin, and the Germans believed in so-called Ostpolitik, which is to reach out to the Russians through permanent dialogue to achieve settlements rather than to focus on deterrence and building up their military. And so you're right. When we struck the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, we promised not to deploy nuclear weapons or permanent military forces or advanced systems into the new member states. But in return, the Russians promised not to threaten or use force against NATO or third parties. Clearly, in 2014, they violated that. But we kept our end of the bargain. And now, finally, I think we're seeing that agreement torn to shreds. And there's going to be a rethink about where NATO deploys and how it deploys. But maybe to summarize, I would say that the Biden team has been at pains. It's bent over backwards to say that Ukraine is not part of NATO. In a way, that could be interpreted as almost green-lighting Putin to escalate. I'd rather have an ambiguous posture there. But they do see a distinction between NATO territory and Ukraine, and that's not entirely unfair.
Yeah. Kadir, what is your take on this? Do you think Zelensky's speech to U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress mobilized American decision makers? And how do you see the recent approach of the United States on Ukraine? Do you think they are providing enough support to Zelensky?
Well, I do think the speech is going to be effective. It's a little early to say, but when he met in a private session with members of Congress, that really generated a lot of pressure from Capitol Hill down Pennsylvania Avenue onto the White House to provide more support. A couple of initiatives came out of that. And I suspect that from the Ukrainian side, which really requested to give these remarks, they're hoping to have the same effect, maybe even a bigger one, given that it's to the entire Congress and published on American platforms. I mean, it ran live in our cable news networks today. So, yeah, I think the goal is to improve the amount of assistance. I think Zelensky at this point probably recognizes that a no-fly zone is not in the offing. And I think he also recognizes, as he acknowledged yesterday, that NATO membership is not on the horizon anywhere in the near future. But beyond that, I think he wants more material and he wants tougher sanctions. And on both of those, I think he believes there's more progress to be made.
Yeah, Kadir, I want to ask you, what is your take on this?
I think there was already an audience in the West for Zelensky's speeches. I'm not sure how it accomplishes more than the existing support and making the existing support more, let's say, transparent and open, out in the open. So it's largely symbolic in my mind. His speech to Canadian, Parliament, his speech to Congress. Of course, in terms of the U.S. policy, it's important to show that it's a bipartisan support. Everybody was applauding, Republicans and Democrats. So it does send a message to perhaps Russians that the West is united still, despite the costs, because I think part of Putin's calculation was that the costs for the West would be high economic costs, and they would avoid doing that. But we have seen the opposite. So the West so far, at least so far, has been able to sort of rise above those economic calculations and say that, okay, we are ready to pay for this. But of course, it's questionable how sustainable it's going to be, because it's biting the economy, it's biting the common people at the gas pump. It's a very, strong sort of debate. When you ask American public, they do say, we can afford to stand with them, even though we have to pay for this. But if if it's these high gas prices and inflation goes on for weeks and months, it's not going to, be such a popular idea anymore. So Zelensky's speech, as I said, accomplishes certain things largely symbolic, because the military help was already going and it's just going to be stronger. But is it going to make a difference in terms of changing Putin's calculation? That's been the question for several weeks. Perhaps, like Peter referred to it, taking certain things off the table and abandoning the policy of ambiguity and being fully transparent may not have been the wisest choice in this case, because you're basically outlining the parameters of a potential military operation. And if you're Putin and you know that there will not be a response, NATO response to Ukraine's invasion or military operation in Ukraine, then you may, go ahead and if you feel like you're in a good position economically, then you might say, okay, I'll bear the consequences. I'll face the economic cost of this. Of course, nothing I think has transpired like Putin may have initially planned, but today it seems that he looks determined to achieve his goals, including regime change in Kiev, because he's not restricting his military operations to the south only, and the Western policy of supporting Kiev and keeping that government alive. Hopefully, it will succeed, but it is becoming, I think, more of a protracted conflict, and then it is more importantly, is it going to be able to change the tide of the conflict in favor of Ukraine? That's the question, and so far I'm not sure about that, because Western action has been much more about punishing Russia than deterring Russia. Deterrence has been unsuccessful largely, and but punishments are severe, and Putin is not even responding to NATO's calls. Apparently, deconflicting calls by NATO are not being even picked up by Russian military. So it is a dangerous time, and so Zelensky's speech is important, but I'm not sure what it accomplishes in terms of turning the tide against Russia.
If I could just make one additional point, picking up on an argument Kadir just made, which is that in the American domestic political context, the administration was already facing a very difficult political environment heading into the midterm elections this November, and inflation was already spiking. So very interestingly, and this is sort of a cynical interpretation, but I think there's a lot to this, when the Biden administration coordinated the energy cutoffs from Russia, so the U.S. is no longer buying Russian oil, which was a relatively small but still significant part of our energy mix, it told the Germans that it fully understood that Germany would not be able to take that decision. In fact, Robert Habeck, the vice chancellor of Germany, he's a member of the Green Party, said in an evening news interview that the Americans discouraged the Germans from cutting off energy. So the Americans can now, and we've seen this from the president to the Speaker of the House to prominent Democratic officials, they've been able in this difficult political environment to go to the public and say, well, we have expensive gas, but it's because of Vladimir Putin. And they've essentially offloaded their own political culpability to Vladimir Putin, or at least attempted to do that. At the same time, they haven't encouraged all of their allies to take a similar step to cut themselves off of, for example, Russian natural gas or oil, because that would spike prices even more. And through the American cutoff, the administration already has enough of an argument to say it's all Vladimir Putin's fault. So here is sort of an intersection of domestic politics and foreign policy, as there is in any country in the world.
Peter, let me just add, I was speaking to a friend of mine today from Germany. Their natural gas bills have already increased by something like tenfold. I couldn't believe it, and I had to ask him again to give me the numbers. The dependency of Europe on Russian natural gas is really high. Unlike the U.S., U.S. has its own resources and it has many other options. But for Europeans, that was the Achilles heel. I think Putin did calculate that, and we are seeing that happen. The EU cannot simply line up with the US to enforce, natural gas and oil sanctions, and that would be basically shooting themselves in the foot. And the government, apparently, the German government, is already considering sort of subsidies for natural gas, and that's causing trouble with Greens and others who are saying that they don't want to encourage subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So it gets pretty complicated, and like you said, the blaming the inflation on Putin, I don't think if they're trying to do that, if they've done that, I don't think that's going to work.
I agree.
Yeah, there will be a NATO meeting next week. I want to ask you, we know that politicians or strategists think in a very different way than ordinary people. If, as an ordinary man or a woman, when you look at the situation in Ukraine, there is an unjust war, a country is being destroyed, people now are fleeing their homes. But from maybe a strategist's perspective, the war has not reached to NATO territory, so it's outside of the coverage of NATO. So Russia can be contained in Ukraine. Maybe they can move on to controlling or occupying Moldova, but it can be understood, and it can be okay for a strategist point of view. Okay, it's okay. Russia will consume its energy. It will start. It will be, stuck in a war of attrition. Putin will consume his credibility, his sources, his everything. So, do you think this can be the case? And what do you expect from NATO meeting? Do you think NATO, US, and its allies will try to contain Russia in Ukraine, just supporting Ukraine with some weapons and turn this region into another, it's like Syria, which will go on for years? Or we should expect a more decisive action from NATO to stop this war?
Well, I would say that NATO is unlikely to stop the resupply of Ukraine, and I'm fairly sure, or I would bet that if the Russians stay in Ukraine, if they manage to level some of these cities and establish themselves, that the West will support, fund, and outfit an insurgency. They will support a government in exile, and they will make Russia bleed in Ukraine. I think that's undoubtedly the case. But I don't think that it will cross the threshold towards more decisive action than that. I don't think that NATO plans on becoming a direct combatant in the conflict. And I see this NATO meeting, this summit meeting of heads of NATO governments, as just an opportunity to rally together, to show unity and cohesion, which is, of course, one of the strategic goals of the United States and of the alliance, is to maintain cohesion in the face of a Russian attempt to perhaps drive a wedge through the Atlantic. So I think that's the case. As for how a strategist might see Russian success or lack thereof, from my point of view, Putin probably can no longer achieve his original war aims, his maximalist war aims. But let's take a scenario where he had succeeded, or where he succeeds in the future, and I'm wrong about this. He manages to basically annex all of southern Ukraine. Kyiv becomes part of his orbit of power, a sphere of influence. He is a pro-Russian satrap governed there, much like Lukashenko in Minsk. At that point, he's really able to project power into southern and southeastern Europe. And I think that would encourage and force a lot of our partners into hedging behavior that isn't really desirable for the United States. I mean, take Turkey. Turkey is already facing Russian power on its southern flank in Syria since 2015. It has a Russian satellite in Armenia to its east. And now Russia is expanding itself on the northern border of the Black Sea, all the way from Georgia, where, of course, it maintains an intervention force, to potentially the border of Romania in Ukraine. And so that would put Turkey under a lot of pressure that I don't think the United States as a NATO ally would find all that desirable. And so I do think we have to take on board the concerns of our allies that a Russian muscle movement, if it succeeds, would really be deleterious for our interests in Europe.
Kadir, at that point, I want to ask you how much Turkish-Russian competition was reflected or highlighted in the US, because in US, when it comes to Turkey and Russia, everybody talks about S-400s, but in reality, Turkey had issues with Russia in Syria. Remember what happened in Idlib a few years ago, in Karabakh, in Azerbaijan. Turkey and Russia was not on the same page, obviously, and also in Libya. Do you think this was highlighted enough? And what do you think about Turkey's recent activities trying to find a way away between Russia and Ukraine and, you know, Turkey's commitment to NATO in this crisis?
Definitely not. Turkey's sort of competition in the region with Russia has not been highlighted at all. On the contrary, it's there's been a simplistic view of, you know, okay, Erdogan is close to Putin and he makes deals, etc. And that, especially under the Trump administration, there was a sort of a very anti-Trump sort of pushed for domestic reasons, domestic political reasons. They basically, you know, the lined up Erdogan with, you know, Putin and Trump. These were all strong men and they got along and they were all bad. But there wasn't a lot of sort of more careful foreign policy analysis, especially when Trump decided to pull out of Syria. That was put on Turkey and said that, you know, Erdogan wants to, you know, go after the Kurds, quote unquote, without distinguishing which Kurds we are talking about. Anyway, I don't want to go through the history, but it was Turkey's sort of foreign policy in the region was depicted in a very simplistic manner, and it became very much part of the discussion about Trump and Trump, Putin, Erdogan. Like whoever was opposed to Trump had to be somehow opposed to Erdogan and Turkey's foreign policy. But that needs to be, I think, much more highlighted. In Libya, Turkey, you know, made some important moves, essentially creating a stalemate and bringing the sides to the table. Actually, it's not a great progress, but there is some serious progress, and there's no fighting right now in Libya because of Turkey's intervention. Like Peter pointed out, Russia has been in Syria since 2015, and at the time, Obama administration said, "Oh, it's going to be their Afghanistan, and they won't be able to do much. You know, we don't really have vital interests in Syria." But Russia didn't see it that way. Russia sees it in a broader regional context. And the same thing for South Caucasus. Turkey's help with Azerbaijan was, you know, against, you know, trying to claim its occupied lands from Armenia, which was largely under Russian control. And, you know, Russia is still a fact there, and a kingmaker in Georgia too, occupied territories, and occupied territories in Crimea. So, I mean, this is all the region around Turkey, and like Peter said, much of Black Sea is now going to be under Russian control or Russian influence. In the medium and long term, it's a serious thing to think about for NATO. If NATO I mean, we've been in a period, NATO leaders have kind of thought of NATO ending in Greece, almost. Like we have NATO and Turkey, almost, which is not true. Turkey is a NATO member. It's a major contributor. So I think there's going to be some, I agree with Peter, in the context of Ukraine war, we may not see real concrete action more than what we have seen so far, but if it's going to encourage a serious rethinking of regional security, European security, Baltic security, Black Sea security, it needs to be done basically. And it unlike previous NATO summits, there's going to be some more concrete stuff to talk about. So in that sense, this summit is going to be very important. But again, I agree with Peter. I don't think it's going to turn the tide of the conflict in Ukraine anytime soon.
Peter, I want to ask you about Turkey's role more. You know, Turkey hosted Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers, and Turkey from the beginning was very clear that this Russian attacks was not acceptable. It was against sovereignty of of territorial integrity of a sovereign state. So so far, I mean, for the last couple of years, we have seen very categorical positioning against Turkey in the US. I mean, when it comes to Turkey, automatically people were very, I mean, their attitude was very anti-Turkey. Now we have this situation, and Turkey is, for its own concerns, is positioning itself against Russian invasion. Do you think this will help Turkish-US relations, and how do you see that? I mean, how do you see US now? Do you think the United States will position itself, recalibrate its foreign policy in regards to Turkey?
Well, it's difficult to say. Clearly, Turkey has won a good deal of reputational favor in Washington. The TB2 drones are the superstars of the war in Ukraine, and everyone recognizes after their experience in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan how effective they operated there, that they are now also making a decisive difference against Russian armor in Ukraine. So I think that is an opportunity perhaps to reset some of the narrative and to push forward some positive areas. But, you know, in the end, I think there are a few structural issues that we still have to work through. Of course, probably the most prominent of which is the American posture in Syria and to the extent of our cooperation with YPG in northern Syria. That is, you know, in the list of priorities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for Turkey. I don't need to tell either of you that. And so while I think there's an opportunity to reset, we still have to work through some of the structural barriers, I think, to improving the relationship. So, yes, I'm optimistic. Turkey clearly has already felt this conflict. I think it was a Turkish flag vessel that was hit in the early days of the war, and the TB2 is playing an active role in Ukraine. President Erdogan has been to Kyiv. Ukrainians have visited Turkey. I mean, it is a Black Sea power, and this is a Black Sea conflict. So Turkey will have a major voice, including at that NATO summit, which you referenced earlier. Perhaps just one addendum to the NATO summit. The other, I think, issue to keep in mind is that in the Madrid summit this upcoming summer, the new strategic concept will be decided upon. Now, some may argue that, you know, the strategic concept isn't exactly read widely by colonels in the American Pentagon, and it doesn't matter all that much, but it does set kind of the trajectory for NATO for the coming years. And if we're going to rethink security in the 3 Cs and in Eastern Europe, then I think that's probably a good place to start.
Kadir, we have seen that Turkish foreign minister also visiting capitals. You know, he met with Lavrov in Moscow. So in a kind of shuttle diplomacy, he's trying to pursue. Do you think this can work, or is it too early for a diplomatic solution? Because when I look at especially the Western media, the motives of Putin are not, I mean, in most Western capitals, there is question about Putin's commitment to diplomacy. Do you think it is time for diplomatic maneuvers, or just sides are trying to buy time, or I don't know? What is your take on that?
Yeah. Thank you, Bora. Earlier we discussed how, you know, it was important for the West to show unity, support Ukraine, and do more as much as they can. But to what end, right? The end goal would be to kind of stop the war somehow. And trying to keep the diplomatic channels open on that front is always helpful. And Turkey is at the forefront of those efforts. Turkey just hosted the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers, but you know, Lavrov didn't look like he had much of a mandate about just about anything, to be honest. So it was just a conversation starter. It was the first time, you know, since the start of the war that they got together. So that's significant. That's important. But there was not much to be achieved concretely other than sort of discussing some humanitarian corridors, but Lavrov couldn't deliver anything. But Turkey is following up and going to Moscow and now going to Kiev while Turkish president is also at NATO discussing this with the NATO leaders, shows, Turkey really is invested in this and wants a rather diplomatic resolution, because what we've seen in other conflicts, when it turns into a proxy war, it can take a long time and then without any kind of resolution. It could be early, like you said, because Putin is not even, as I mentioned earlier in the show, he's not even responding to deconfliction mechanisms. Like he's not even responding, his military is not responding to NATO. So in that sense, Putin is probably feeling like he needs a victory before discussing anything in a serious manner. And that victory, to me, I've discussed it I've argued in other shows that, somehow he needs to take over Kiev. The longer it takes, the worse for him, and he will have a harder time finding a face-saving formula, and it's not going to be easy at all. But if he doesn't take over Kiev, and if he settles just for the Donbas region, and even there's no clear victory so far. Let's assume he achieved that, and then he negotiates with Zelensky. I'm not sure if that's going to satisfy Putin at this point, because he's now borne the brunt of all this economic pressure, and Russian economy is in tatters. Even the stock market hasn't opened for several weeks now. I think he might say, okay, I've already incurred all the costs, and why not achieve all my goals? So he might be in a more maximalist mode. And I agree with Peter. I don't think he'll realistically be able to achieve those maximalist goals. So in that sense, Turkey's diplomacy may be a little bit early, but it's better to be early than late, and keep the conversations, keep the channels open. And Turkey is already facing the impact of this war in terms of inflation, gas prices, etc.
Putin needs a quick victory, obviously. The Russian army is facing a fierce resistance. That's obvious. I remember the first statement of President Biden when this crisis started. He talked about gradual impact of strong sanctions, if I'm not wrong. Peter, do you think there is a sense of urgency in US side, or the United States is just waiting Putin to bleed a little bit more in Ukraine? How do you see that?
I think the stair-step approach that the Biden administration took on sanctions was a mistake. They essentially got lucky that the Ukrainians were able to resist and hold out as long as they have. I think they should have gone for serious sanctions from the get-go. If the announcement is that you're going to cripple the Russian financial sector, or that sanctions are going to really damage the Russian economy, then an opening move of sanctioning U.S. business activity in the Donbass, as if anyone's investing in startups in Luhansk or Donetsk, I think is way short of where we should have actually been. But thankfully, the Ukrainians held out, and that's allowed the administration to recalibrate, to up the pressure, and to move towards a stronger sanctions package. In general, though, I think the American attitude, or maybe it's just my attitude and my own analysis, is that you cannot get at the negotiating table what you haven't achieved on the battlefield. And so I do think Putin may be preparing for a negotiation, but as Kadir mentioned, it's still some time off. Clearly, his shelling of Mariupol, that encircled city on the Sea of Azov, which is now being besieged by Russian troops and which has taken a hammer blow of Russian artillery and other weapon systems, killing lots of civilians, is a way of foreshadowing for Putin to Zelensky, this is the fate that may await Kyiv if you don't come eventually to terms, or if you don't stand down from your own political goals. And so all of this, I think, is in a way at some level posturing, because as Clausewitz, of course, said, war is just politics or continuation of politics by other means, and they will try to match up the best end state the Russians at this point can go for with their military operations.
Yeah, I think with this we came to the end of this show. There will be NATO meeting next week, and I think we will be talking about the crisis in Ukraine longer than we think, I believe. Kadir, do you have anything to say before we go?
No, I just, I hope that the situation in Ukraine can be resolved quickly, but as I said, it may not. It may take weeks, months, hopefully not years, but
but the cost is rising. Now we have 3 million refugees going to Europe, so it will be more than a regional crisis probably. Peter Rao, thank you very much for joining us from.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kadir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bora, and thank you, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.